Yeah, okay, let's start. Okay, so let's start without the slides, and then as soon as we can also get the slides, we will sync up. So, well, first of all, hello, good morning. Thank you for being here. So my name is Vittorio Bertola. I'm the head of policy of Open Exchange, which is a German open source software maker. We make 2 or 3 email and DNS products well known, where the best known is Dovecot, which is in any Linux distribution as an IMAP server. So the reason why I'm here today is that I wanted to talk about the future of the open source community, and especially around the regulatory trends and policy trends that we see in Europe, but that are extending to the rest of the world. So I'd like not to take too much time. I wanted to also hear some perspectives, especially local perspectives. So in general, I mean, we tend to think that the open source is just about the licensing. So we say software is open source if it's released under a certain licensing model which has certain freedoms. And this is true. But it's important to understand that open source can only exist also because of the development model. So it's not just enough to have that kind of license. There are some assumptions around how the development of the code happens. And there are several, I mean, I call them pillars of the open source development model. So you will see them in the slides, but more or less we can summarize them in 4 of them. One is that you really have no borders. So the development of the code is global. There's no, I mean, you don't get asked a passport when you contribute code. And usually projects have maybe some core developers in a certain part of the world, but then they have contributions from all around the world. And whenever you commit code or whenever you download it, you compile it, you run it, the code and the data flow around the world. Then there's another pillar which is about not having warranties. This is actually written in many of the licenses, but I mean, you use the open source software at your own risk. So the developers don't take any responsibility for any bug or vulnerability, and they will not pay you compensation if something goes wrong. So you cannot expect them to be legally liable for this. So we said no borders and no warranty, and then the third one is that there's no compensation. So I mean, sometimes people are paid. I mean, engineers in our company are actually paid to develop open source software, but it's not intrinsic, it's not directly monetized. You're not directly monetizing your code. You're maybe selling services or other things or commercial extensions, depending on which business model you have, but there's no direct expectation. And so this is a problem. It's increasingly a problem because maintainers and developers are often underfunded, often doing this in their spare time, and there are projects that really suffer from lack of paid resources. And the final pillar is that there's no control over the use of the code. So even if you're the developer, you don't get to decide the people that can use the code. Everybody can use the code. You don't get to decide the purpose. So you cannot say, I don't want my code to be used for whatever, military work or whatever, crime or whatever. So these are assumptions, and if you take away these pillars, the open source development model really stops working. But the problem is that now we have to cope with bad things happening. They've always been happening, but there's some high-profile cases that we saw in the recent case. I mean, I think everybody knows about this. So like the Log4j case, which was a pretty famous vulnerability that was discovered. And the point, I mean, as the XKCD, the cartoon shows, is that this was a small library, but it was used everywhere. And so all of a sudden, like hundreds of millions of devices were insecure, and they had a vulnerability that had been there for almost 10 years. And even worse, last year, there was the XZ case in which, I mean, a malicious vector was found, but the problem is that it was there on purpose. So then it was discovered that this vector has been actually introduced by the maintainer of the project. And this person who nobody knew, I mean, it was online, so nobody knew who it was, identity or whatever, just nicknames. And the person had gained the trust of the original maintainer with several years of work, contributing, helping, up to the point in which they gained access rights and release rights for the entire project. And it turns out this was possibly a state actor or a quasi-state actor, so Secret Service or someone, I mean, hacker working for some country that wanted to push this vulnerability so that to use this very generally used library to be able to access machines. So this scared really the governments, because the problem is that now FOSS is really a utility. So we tend to think this is like, fun code. It's nice. We like to develop code. But sorry, at this point in time, I mean, the internet connectivity, the basic platforms, email, messaging, whatever, cloud storage, are really like utilities, like water, electricity. So if they are not there, society stops. All the economy, all the society, public opinion. So they are really crucial. And they are all based on free software. Like over 90% of the code that runs the internet is free software. And the rest maybe is proprietary expansions of free software projects. And so we are at the point in which society really needs free software to be available, to be there, and to be safe and secure. And so this is why now governments are stepping in. I mean, it's usual in any industry, like when cars were introduced for the first years, it was like startups and everybody was doing whatever they wanted 100 years ago. Then the government, I mean, as soon as it became ubiquitous, governments started to regulate how you can make a car. And it's happening the same for software. It's going to happen everywhere. And the governments have at least 3 categories of problems. So the first one is security. So they have to ensure that the software is secure because it's so fundamental to society. And so they have to find a way to force the developers to care about security, even if, open source software is generally more secure even than the proprietary one. But there have been cases like Log4j in which simply there were no resources, not enough resources for security. The second problem that governments have is sovereignty. So this is especially very heavily felt now in Europe, since all the platforms we use come from the US and all the hardware we use comes from China. And so the problem is that whenever there's some kind of even just commercial war with the US, like it's starting to happen, or with China, then you risk, if the other country starts using this as a weapon against you, you're in trouble, because you really need these services. And so how can we ensure as a collectivity in a country that the software we use is always available, will not be used against us, will not be poisoned or used as by any foreign country. And the third problem that the governments have is control, because governments want to control content, they want to introduce all kinds of controls, age verification for social media, rather than blocking content, blocking illegal streaming of football matches, whatever. And they need the code to implement this. So they need to force the developers that often don't like this kind of control to implement these features and to keep them in. Since the code is open, so you could just compile them out. So they have to find ways to guarantee control. So the problem is that these needs of the governments now are eroding the 4 pillars. So the need for security is eroding the no warranty thing. So the pyramid you see there is a picture from the European Commission. It's a set of 40 different standards that they are developing by product or genre, and any software developer will have to implement to ensure that the code is secure. So the government will tell you how you can write code and how you can maintain it, how you release security fixes and deal with vulnerabilities and whatever. And this is eroding the no warranty because the developers are legally responsible for the code, and so they will pay damage compensation if the code goes wrong. Does something wrong, and or they even go to. There are some cases there might be penal responsibility. You can even go to jail. This is in some proposals, and the need for basically for sovereignty is eroding the no borders pillar, because now the government wants to make sure that the local community has the know-how to run the code. And so they would like to use code that is made locally in your country and avoid code that is made somewhere else. And in the open source development model, this doesn't make sense. This just, there are data localization laws, so you have to store your data in the country, not elsewhere. And so all these things are making it difficult to continue or creating problems for the development model. And also, finally, the need for control is, actually eroding the principle that the developers don't control the use of the software. So the government wants you to implement features to restrict the use of the software. And against, there's been a discussion, for example, a big discussion in Debian in Europe, of what do we do if we are required to implement age verification access in the operating system. And some say we should just stop distributing Debian in Europe. But there's a discussion on whether we can, as a community, how to react to this. And so this is what I wanted to say. In the end, this is also going to erode the no compensation principle, because in the end, you need money. So if you're going to be responsible, for damage, for example, then you need an insurance, possibly. Then you need money to pay for it, and it's an extra cost on top of your code activity, which is already maybe a volunteer activity that you do at night or in the weekend. And so you need to pay for lawyers if you get problems. You need, there are extra costs and extra risks that make you think, do I really want to continue doing this? So, in general, is the open source world continuing to work? I mean, can we cope as a community with this? I mean, some people will. I mean, I work for an open source company. We already get security certifications, ISO 27001. I mean, because I mean, it's a business, so you can find the money to cope with this cost. It's just a bit of extra cost. And also the global open source foundations, people like the Linux Foundation, Eclipse, Apache, these people are already equipping for that. Actually, one of the solutions will be that many projects will try to go into these foundations, have them become stewards, so that they can take care of the legal part and all these responsibilities. And I mean, anyone doing this as a job, more or less, I mean, there will be an employer that can pay or cope with the responsibility. But the problem is that even in the basic infrastructure, there are projects that are just pure non-profit volunteer projects. So anyway, we are at the end. So in the end, it's, I mean, will these people be able to continue? And if they stop, what will happen to the entire architecture of open source software? What happens if some libraries become unavailable or unmaintained? There's already maintainer pressure, so there's already maintainers that are complaining and saying, I really can't continue doing this, there's too much to do and I don't have time. So one alternative would be, again, the industrialization of open source, so making all open source a business and getting companies to do this. But of course, we would lose a lot of the original open source development model. And so the question was, can we do something? Or, well, of course, I don't know if anyone had similar experiences with other countries. This is a discussion mostly in the European Union now, but I wanted to hear feedback if anyone has. So thank you. Do we have time for questions, or we're late, but I think we gained some time. The talk was planned for around 10 minutes. So.
Thank you. I'm so sorry about the delay, but I think we've managed to cover all the topics. So are there any questions? I think we have time for one or two.
Yeah. Or comments.
So what are your thoughts? Where?
No, I think that this, I mean, everybody still has to realize this.
Yes.
So it's coming, it's starting to happen, but it will take years because laws take years.
Yeah.
But I think it's something in which people should start thinking at and saying, how can I cope with this kind of extra responsibilities?
Sure. And do you have any opinions about which way this should go?
I think it really depends on what you do. So if you can, you need some revenue source. So I mean, we have maybe to help the smaller projects to get funding. There are, I mean, when government started to say we have to require developers to implement security or do security a certain way, we as the community went back and said, why don't you put money on the table instead? So the good way to get more security in open source projects is contributing funding for pen tests, for all these kind of security activity and development. And so we might convince the European Commission to put some money for this. But at the same time, I mean, I think that's a problem. So basically, finding good ways to get funding.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Please give a